Welcome everybody. I am beyond delighted and excited to be here, and thank you all so much. This is the start of year 2 of Literature Across Borders, which is Meghaa's wonderful brainchild, and we co-founded it together last year in partnership with the Green Literature Festival and for the Shoki University. And it's just amazing to be moving this project forward. We've had some funding, we've had some publications, and we are on to expansion and development, which I'm sure Meghaa will be happy to tell you about later. I will pop in the chat at some point while we're in the call the new project page at BSU that is our public facing expression of what we do, and you can find out more about it, and that's where this recording will be in due course. But it's just the most lovely thing to be able to engage on an international basis with these themes and with children's books. Children's books really have the power to change the world, to change how we feel about things, to empower young people as they grow, to feel that their voices can be heard, and to understand the world they live in order to have the most power. But in order for that set of voices to change things, we can't just be one country acting alone, especially in relation to green issues, which is where this started. That we are moving into sort of other human rights and social issues, which is so exciting. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Meghaa Gupta, who's going to introduce more of the project and move us into our wonderful event. Two of our wonderful pairings, both authors, are joining together to have a dialogue about their books, and we can't thank them enough. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much, Lexi, for that very warm introduction. And yes, we are beyond delighted that we are in season 2 of Literature Across Borders. At the heart of Literature Across Borders is the idea of how authors in different cultural contexts approach thematically related, sort of similar themes, So we're very delighted today to have the authors of our first book pairing, Samantha Stewart or Sam Stewart and AB Majudar or AB Majudar. And we have their books Fireblood, The First Flight, and The Torchbearers, which are both this fantastic exploration of fantasy and mythology in a world that is sort of, troubled by the forces of greed, and to know a little bit more about how they sort of wrote these texts. But before I get into the conversation with them, a quick introduction to both our authors. Sam Stewart is a lecturer at Spa University, a novelist, and a freelance editorial consultant for some of the biggest publishing houses in the world, in which she's worked for the last 30 years. As a publishing manager, she's been involved in the publication of many best-selling and award-winning books, particularly in the fascinating world of children's publishing. Sam has published 3 novels, 2 of which were shortlisted for the Queen of Teen Award. She is currently writing the sequel to Fireblood, The First Flight, which was published in 2023. AB Majudar loves stories and shares them through her writing, teaching, and dancing. After earning a degree in English from the University of California, Berkeley, and then a master's in education, she began teaching high school students English and sharing her love of reading and writing with them. Eventually, while raising her 3 children, AB began to write books she had always wanted to read. Her debut novel, The Torchbearers, was published by Penguin Books in India in 2020 and was shortlisted for the Neve Award for Excellence in Children's Literature. In addition to writing, AB teaches Bharatnatyam, a classical Indian dance form, through her dance school. As an Ohio teaching artist, she performs and teaches in classrooms and other educational venues. She also shares traditional stories on her Instagram and YouTube channels, sustaining the deeper meaning of the tales while adapting them for modern times. So thank you so much, AB and Sam, for joining us today for this first dialogue. So delighted to have you both. And without wasting another minute, I'm going to get right into the conversation. You've both come from very different sort of worlds into writing. Sam, you've worked in publishing for so many years, and Ami, you've taught. So could you sort of take us through your journeys into writing? What were some of the bigger challenges that you faced in your pathways to becoming authors? Shall we start with you, Ami?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, for having this kind of conversation, green literature. And you're so right that it is children who will do something about what's happening on our planet in all these spaces. And literature gets us at least starting to talk and think about it. So just so delighted to be with this team. And Sam, I've loved your book. As I'm reading it, I got it, like I said, a little late, so I'm enjoying it so much. So thank you to all of you. Yes, so as a teacher, as a dancer, as a storyteller, those are very in the moment forms of storytelling. They are ever changing, they're adapting to the audience, they're adapting to a kid looking like, oh my gosh, and that there's a lot of that. And with dance, it's every time you get on stage or teach an item. And Bharatanatyam in particular is a very story-based, story-heavy form of classical dance. And the facial expressions, the hand move, they all tell part of the story. But every time you perform it or teach it, the story might change a little bit. So there's a lot of fluidity in that form of storytelling and all my forms of storytelling that I've done. So when I sat down to write, I think the biggest hang up was my own, which is, oh my gosh, this is permanent. This is it. This is the version. And I think I had to get over my own fears of that. There wasn't going to be a do-over, so to speak. But in doing that, I think it really enabled me to look at craft, to look at what in the story was going to stand and last, and what I really wanted to share through my words and my writing. So that process, I think, was very good. I think I've written and rewritten this particular story over many, many years. And then when it finally took on this form and a life of its own, I knew I had something that was powerful and that was worth truly sharing and lasting. So I would say my teaching, my storytelling, my dancing, all have enabled me to develop, I think, the dramatic part of the storytelling, the part that just enjoys a good story and wants to leap right in. And then I guess the English degree finally did its work, and the writing process itself was a discovery for me about what I'm capable of and what story I really want to tell.
Sam?
Yes, just to reiterate what Ami has said about the importance of writing for children and how valuable that is in shaping culture and people's responses to world events and emotions and how we deal with things. It's just, I feel so privileged to be in the world of writing for young people. And also to be working in it. And I think I have always wanted to be writing books. I remember being 9 years old, and this is the real inspiration for Fireblood, is that I remember being 9 and there were no books for 9-year-olds. There were only books for 12-year-olds, or there were books for 7-year-olds. There was no powerful 9-year-old character, and I vowed I was going to write a book for that had a protagonist who was 9 years old, and that was really important to me because actually, if we look at where the world is now, that speaks to what we're all trying to do, which is ensure that modern literature, the books we're publishing today, are representing children of all kinds, all ages, all demographics, all cultures, all histories. And I wanted to write a book that did that. Fireblood for me, I guess it reflects my love of fantasy from a young person. I was reading Narnia, Lord of the Rings, Ursula Le Guin. All of those kinds of things were really inspirational to me. I loved being able to escape into a completely different place. My childhood was a little challenging, to say the least, and being able to go to the library was just an extraordinary experience for us as children growing up there. And we had very few opportunities to do that. We had very little access to literature. We had one public library which didn't have very much in it at all. I grew up in South Africa. I was born in Zambia, and it's hard to get books there. It's expensive. So for me, coming to the United Kingdom and being able to take out 9 different books from a library, even though there's such pressure on those things, that's a massive privilege. And my writing has been informed by wanting to allow children into this magical escapist world. And the stories have been in my head for such a long time. I was born on bonfire night and have always been obsessed with fire. I nearly burned my house down when I was 3 with my baby sister in the room. And so I knew it was going to be something around fire. And I love kind of, you know, nitty gritty crime fiction and the melodrama. So I knew there was going to be blood. So that's Fireblood. But those are the reasons why I wanted to write this book. And I think my biggest kind of obstacles, if you like, to that process have been time. I'm sure Ami would agree, having children is an extremely challenging thing, because you're wanting to prioritize your family all the time, or perhaps your career. As I say, I've been in publishing for 30 years, and that is not an easy space in which to exist. It's you know, you're reading all the time. So time for me has been the biggest challenge. And then the biggest sort of excitement around it was when I was writing on the train one day, going up to my day job, and I was pounding away. I was writing some kind of action scene, I think, and there was a little girl and her family who got on the train with us, and her mum and her baby brother were sitting across the way, and this little girl came and sat next to me, and I just felt this feeling on my left. I was typing away and I could feel something on my shoulder, and I turned and looked, and this little girl was leaning in to read my screen, and I kept writing and sort of kept on going, and she was leaning closer and closer into my screen. And I thought, oh, I'm writing something that a child reader wants to read. So that was the start of my journey. Very long way round of explaining your question, Meghaa. Thank you.
That's lovely, though. I mean, that's a lovely anecdote. And also, I think you touched upon the importance of public libraries. And we do have a sort of a library movement here in India, because there's so many people who probably aren't accessing books because there aren't enough of public libraries to get those books. But there are movements and there are people who open those in some of the underprivileged neighborhoods. At least I'm aware of a couple in Delhi. And it's just so important to hear these things sort of enunciated. But I'm going to get on to the next question, because both of you have these novels set in fantasy and mythology. And I'm very interested in the sort of cultural references that lace both of your novels. I mean, I was very aware of the references in Ami's novel, because she talks of Hindu gods, and I've grown up with those stories. But when I was reading your novel, Sam, I wasn't exactly aware of the references. I mean, obviously, dragons are not something which come up in, a lot of children's novels in our part of the world. But it's thanks to reading that I got to know about the whole myth of St. George and the dragon. And I was very interested in understanding why fantasy, why mythology, and how did these sort of cultural ideas inform your writing. Sam, do you want to go? Or I'm just always struggling with this. Ami, maybe yes, we'll loop back to you. I'll be a back and forth, like on a tennis court.
Sure. No, I'm with you in that the presence of mythology and like a world beyond the world that we see in front of us, I think is fascinating. And I think in ancient times, all over the world, I think that the natural world was far more integral to people's day-to-day existence than it is today. And unfortunately or fortunately, I think when modernization happened, I think when pantheism and polytheism started to fade, you kind of see, I think human beings start to struggle with where they are in the natural world and how to relate to the world around them. And so I was reading a fascinating book called Looking for the Hidden Folk about, you might have read that, just about how these stories, how elves and dwarves and all of them, like kind of, those stories went underground and they pop up in ways that you least expect. And so I think the interesting thing about Hindu mythology is it is still a living mythology. It is a living way of looking at the world, and it's ever changing. And I think it's wonderful that India, which I think has, mythologically has always been very in tune with it, now is paying attention to the impact of the environment. And I read about a lot of wildlife initiatives there and stuff, which inspire me and give me hope. So when it came to Torchbearers, it was very natural to me that the idea of Bhumi Devi, like the earth goddess, being this character, being this very generous, almost generous to a fault type of goddess, it just made sense. And I grew up singing this prayer that described her, Samudra Vasane Devi, like a goddess who's clothed by the oceans. Which I found just this evocative image. And so to make the gods Agni, Vayu, Varun, like these gods have personalities, and that was very natural to me. And I think the challenge for me, and I hope to kind of touch on this more in future books, is how to bring them into the modern world in a way that is, relatable and connectable, and to give them that human element, which I think makes them fascinating. And then how to connect them to the human characters within. So I loved that challenge of playing with very huge universal elemental themes, and then bringing them into the modern world, which seems almost hostile toward them. And I sense that as I'm reading Fireblood, that's something that kind of is in the background constantly, and you kind of have these glimpses of that world kind of peering through, cutting through what is otherwise a very modern space. So I love that.
Oh, thank you, Ami. And I what I love about the way you've created your mythological the gods essentially appearing in their different forms is they do feel very relevant and modern, and they have these wonderful colloquial quirks in the way they speak, and the humor is so great. It makes us really kind of understand them as beings. And I wanted to do the same with the saints that are the sort of the pillars of Fireblood, really, where we have St. George. And I was interested in taking the mythology and really sort of teasing it apart and investing it with personality. So we've seen such a massive upward trend in retellings, haven't we, in the market, especially for YA fiction. And so I guess I was doing this from a sort of a middle grade perspective a long time ago. I started writing this 10 years ago. And I like the idea of St. George, the parts of him that we don't really understand. So he wasn't actually English. He was this very powerful, dark-skinned man. No one knows where he came from, really. And so I like the fact that there are parts of him that we are only understanding through history now. And how would he look if he was in this fantastical world? I like the idea of him being a protector rather than a slayer. And I like the idea of Patrick, another one of my saints, the patron saint of Ireland. I like the idea of him being really sort of kick-ass, and I kind of see him in tight-fitting black combat gear. Looking very handsome, and I can defeat all in that very sort of two-dimensional way. But I've enjoyed having fun with his sort of insecurities and his vulnerabilities, and his sort of feelings of guilt around these two children characters as well. So it's great to take something that, as Ami said, so iconic and so integral to people's understanding of their cultural heritages, and invest it with a modern personality and see what that looks like. It's been really fun.
Yes, I think that's the beauty of both the sort of novels, that they take this really grandiose idea of gods and mythology, and with children are sort of, they have this image of it as something really iconic, and then somehow humanizing it and making it really sort of relatable, which is such a lovely thing that both of you have done so well in your work. And I actually, taking off on my third question from that, is so you have this really grand presence of the gods and of these mythological characters, and within that you have these child protagonists who are very vulnerable and yet possess this sort of astonishing power. And I was wondering, was this something that you sort of had in your mind from the very beginning, or was it something that sort of you decided to do more organically as you were thinking through your stories, Amy?
So that's a great question, and it is something that I wrestled with quite a bit. And I will give a lot of credit to my editor, who she's no longer with Penguin India, but she's phenomenal still, Smeed Zaveri. She and I went back and forth, and one of the things that she came back with is that in my earlier versions, that it felt like the children were more observers, bystanders, taking it in. Things were happening to them. They were, they had little powers, but they weren't owning it. And she wanted to give them more agency. And I thought that was a great challenge for me to take up, how to give them agency as very vulnerable beings, as beings who may not have actual powers. They can't blow something up or something. So I had to really play with that. What was that? And so I started to, and not to give away too many spoilers, but I had, Prem, who is the writer, writing as his power. And then Samhita, who's very caring about the environment. She is really the environmentalist in the book, having this power of healing and caring and being fearless about wanting to protect creatures, wanting to protect trees, the earth, all of that. And then Kushal having the power of music, which is kind of one of those intangible powers that, move us emotionally. And so all of these, those things were there, but I think giving them full form, enabling them to come into battle as active participants. And one thing that's super interesting about, and this is very steeped in Hindu thought, is the idea that every being has the divine within it. And it's not just one big master god up there and then all of us just play things, but that every human, and not even every human, every soul, plant, animal, everything has the divine and this potential within it. And so it wasn't a big leap to say that what they were doing was world changing and was could alter the course of the battle. So I really wanted to bring that out, and it was just a challenge to do it convincingly and well, and not give them a snap their fingers and all of a sudden everything's okay power. And they had to struggle with it. And they had to struggle, I think, with their own doubt, their own unity among each other. And so that part was really fun. And then in that same space, to have the gods have vulnerabilities too. They were not all powerful. And I think that was also super, super important. And I could not have someone just swoop in and make it all okay. So that was a fun thing to do. So what a great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ami. What a small world, because I've worked with Smith at Penguin India, and she is one of our best editors here. But also, I think when I was reading your book, it reminded me of this cartoon I used to watch as a kid called Captain Planet, which is a very American thing. But, there's that kid there who has the power of heart. And for the longest time, I'm wondering, what is this power of heart? So when you were talking about music being this sort of amorphous power, I was thinking of that, in my head. But bringing that same question to you, Sam, if you could pick up, do you want me to repeat it?
I love this question. I was desperate for my characters to be very vulnerable, and that's because I love themes of growth and how self-recognition can build emotional depth and give a character agency as well. So I had characters who were really struggling with quite a lot of adversity. Finn has a big hump on his back, and Tula doesn't speak. She's been traumatized by a childhood accident, which meant we had to get some sensitivity reads of the book to make sure I was doing everything I needed to be doing and being respectful of those kinds of challenges that people face in the real world. But then we see how that agency in the book moves along. And what I didn't want to have happen is for these characters to be fixed. It was really important to me that they acknowledged those vulnerabilities and they worked within them and created powers from those. So, for instance, Tula, who cannot speak, she has this absolutely incredible way of doing sort of sign language, and it's not the sort of widely recognized BSL stuff. It's more what we see in the natural kingdom. So, you know, how a horse might twitch its eyebrow, or a dog might, you know, shiver in a certain way, that would all mean something. So Tula speaks with her whole body. And their mother was, I'm so interested, Ami, to hear how you have this sort of passion for music and how powerful that can be, because music is underpins a lot of what is happening in Fireblood in the first flight, where how you sing a song can change how a volcano will react. And so, you know, all of that, and how you sing it, and using Welsh and the language around that in a way that can be transformative and powerful. So Tula, in how she communicates, and how she eventually discovers that actually it's her fear that has created this vulnerability in her, and she's able to relinquish it in a certain way. And then Finn, physically he changes, but he doesn't lose the hunch on his back. It becomes something else, which actually is part of his special powers and magics. And what I've loved doing is creating vulnerabilities in the adult characters. That's so much fun, to make grown-ups really ridiculous in certain ways. And some of my mythological creatures, and one of the most powerful ones is this grey griffin, and he, I think his big vulnerability is his bad mood. So I love having this griffin. He's in such a bad mood, and he has a bad temper, and he does stuff when he's in his bad temper, and then he has to apologize. I love it, him having to say sorry to the kids. So that's great. So yeah, vulnerability. That's I began my story thinking I wanted these children, and I think for me that's because I want readers to feel that sense of yes, when they overcome things, and when they get these powers and are able to act with agency. I think that's a great feeling for a reader.
Both of your replies sort of reminded me of Catherine Rundell's book, Why You Should Read Children's Books Even Though You Are So Old and Wise. And what one of my favorite passages from that book is where she talks about how, children negotiate the world. They have no political power, no economic power. They negotiate the world in the knowledge of that vulnerability. And sometimes, despite growing up, we as adults also feel vulnerable and powerless. And that's the time we need to sort of run back to children's books and remind ourselves that it is okay to be vulnerable, even though you are not so old and not so wise, maybe. But thank you for that. And I'm going to now ask you both, because there's another similarity in both of your books, which is that you've used really interesting, you've sort of peppered your narratives with very interesting verses. And, I was wondering how easy or difficult was that? How easy or difficult was it to come up with something suitable? Again, was it sort of a pre-decided thing that you want to have these verses in the narrative? Did you sort of think about, okay, maybe it might make for interesting reading sessions with children? So Ami.
Yeah, I knew that verses and music and all would be, and the musicality of the language, because you can't obviously have a sound on the page, but I knew that would be important. It was important to me, especially because so many of the ancient wisdoms have come through in hymns, and those have a very clear cadence. Like even the hand gestures with which like hymns from the Vedas are sung matter. The pitch matters a lot in a given, and whether you hold a syllable or not, those things are really important. And obviously in English, we may not have that exact translation. And so I was not interested in translating, because I knew that was basically impossible to do justice to very ancient ideas. But I wanted to convey I guess the soul of those verses. So to be honest with you, I'm not at all a poet. My husband is an amazing poet. And he's been so supportive throughout my writing journey, but he's a novelist and poet and all these things. But I had to be like, no, don't come near me when I'm doing my verses, because I'm like, you'll just like casually say something, it'll be perfect. And I'll be like, no. So I was like, no, don't even. I said, if I need you, I'll tell you. And he was obviously very supportive of that. But for me, it was intimidating to write you know, even these short verses, and I could come up with a whole chapter, and then I'd sit down with this verse and I'm like, oh my gosh. And all my old scanning would come back and I was struggling, and, you know, it's like, which meter is that? So that was honestly a hard thing for me to do, but I liked it because it forced me to convey a very huge idea in 4 lines. And I think as a writer, that was a lot of growth. And to listen to the music of the language, I think was an amazing process. So I really did want to do justice to those ideas in a short number of words. So.
Yes, in fact, I thought that was quite instinctive, because once I read about your dancing background, it just seemed like something very natural. But Sam, what about you and the verses in Fireblood?
Exactly the same as Ami. I'm not at all musical, but I love music and appreciate it, and it really moves me emotionally. So I pay no attention to rhythm in terms of structured iambic pentameters, etc., because I just can't. And my verse is free verse, and I wanted to be able to translate that into Welsh and for it to sound really wonderful. And I wanted the sense on the page to be of many characters weaving melodies through those words as well. But I completely agree with Ami that the power of verse to bring a bit of information into a small space, from a big idea into a small space. Verse is absolutely brilliant for that. It's a struggle, but I think it's worth it.
Yes, I have always struggled with verse. So I was just amazed at how beautifully you were able to sort of weave it into your narrative. And I thought it was quite bold and nice. But actually, on that note, I think I'd want you to reflect a little bit more on your writing process for students and everyone listening. How do you plan and structure your stories? I mean, because both of you obviously been working on these books without a publishing contract. So, how hard is it to sort of impose that discipline and get those deadlines, self-imposed deadlines to actually work for you? And how much thought do you give to your target audience when you're working on that first draft, Ami?
So I am one of those adults who loves children's books still, and will till the end do so. So I did not think of my target audience as like a child per se. I mean, also I hate when books talk down to children. So I was very keen that I would not do that, and I was like, age 8 to 108, should be able to enjoy it. So that was not as much in my mind. I think the writing of this was almost a decade before I actually came up with this version. And my previous version had, and because I think I just was writing it as my children were very young, and it was like, slogging through, but I had an idea, and the buildup was just taking chapters and chapters. I was like 100,000 words into it, and the actual exciting thing of the fish had not happened. And then I realized that was all wrong, and children don't have nobody really has the patience to go through build up before something exciting happens. So I still remember I was driving from Detroit back to Columbus, and my grandmother had just passed away, and she was like this huge influence for me. And she shows up as the River Ganga in the book, because her name meant Ganga. And so she, I was thinking, and then I was convinced that her like slightly hurried nature was making me write, because all of a sudden I had this idea, and it was like I was possessed, and it just came. And I started with that moment of the fish landing in Brim's hands, which is the first chapter, and it just flowed. And then all my backstory I was able to bring in, and I didn't use very many of those actual passages at all, but I think all that mental work maybe kicked in, and it just flowed better. And then I actually wrote those first 3 chapters, submitted it, and they came back saying, hey, we love it. Can we read the rest? And I'm like, well, I guess I need to write the rest. So that lit a fire. So anyway, I feel like it was definitely a good challenge to have. And I think getting into the publishing space I was fortunate in that they were very receptive to what I was writing. It has been much more of a struggle in America, or I guess worldwide, because I'm dealing with a relatively unfamiliar mythology. And so I'm actually, that's part of my current project, is how to get it to the US. But I hope I answered all of the.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that, I think, in the last question. But yeah, Sam, how was?
Yeah, I think the process for me felt very tangible, the process itself, because I've been working in publishing since I was very young, and I knew I had the story I wanted to tell. I knew what characters I wanted to be in there, and I did have a 9-year-old in my head, but I'm like you, Ami. I do not believe in writing for an age in terms of language or structure or grammar or anything like that. I believe in writing for a person. And to my mind, it's much harder writing for children than it is for adults. Children are far more discerning. They are much pickier. They have much better things to do than to be sitting still for long periods of time. So for me, I wanted to entrance a busy 9-year-old who perhaps wasn't that keen on writing. And that 9-year-old was sometimes a boy and sometimes a girl, but mostly it was me when I was 9. That's who I was writing for. And I started the writing process with this idea of character. Who were the characters, and what would happen to them? And that I believe quite strongly in the 9-word synopsis. So because I am I find plotting can be quite hard because I get distracted by lovely ideas along the way, and I think, oh, they could do that, and then suddenly my characters are running off and doing unruly things, and that is not okay. I have to bring them back in with a hard leash. So the way I structure my books is I will sit down and I will write a 9-word synopsis, and it will be just as an example. So a 9-word synopsis for Romeo and Juliet will be boy meets girl. God, I've lost the plot already. Boy meets girl. Girl then dies. Boy then dies. Just something like that. And so you boil it down to 9 words only. And once you have that, you're away, because that's the hardest thing, is to boil everything down to this tiny, tiny thing. And then what I do is I think beginning, middle, end. And I will say to myself, I want to do a lot of short chapters. I like to read in that way. And so that's the way I like to write as well, where it's quite episodic. So each chapter holds an idea. And I will literally have an Excel spreadsheet, and I will have my chapter number. I'll have the time that it is it Monday, Tuesday. I'll have the action in the next column along, and in my final column, I'll have what I want my reader to feel. And I think that can be really helpful in writing, is that you're constantly either you want your reader to feel something or understand something. So that really helps to keep track of reveals and plot twists, and also how you're building emotion, how you're building character growth. And I say that and I do all that, and then it doesn't go to plan because of these damn characters. Patrick is extremely unruly as a character. He is always going off and flirting with another character called Angelina, and that is not okay. So those kinds of things happen, and then when I get to the end, I will take a view of it. I'll leave it for 2 weeks, and then I'll come back in and read it as a with fresh eyes. But what I find the most important and valuable part of my writing process is that I will set aside 45 minutes twice a day to come into it. And what I'm doing in the 45 minutes is I'm reading through the stuff I've written the day before. So I'll read that. And as I read it, I'm editing, tweaking, putting in little tiny bits and pieces, rejigging a sentence that doesn't quite flow, etc. And then I'm in it. And then the writing, when I get to the last sentence of what I wrote the day before, I'm already ready to write into the next piece. And so off I go again. And sometimes I come back and break chapters up a little bit more or make chapters a bit longer. But that's what I find really helpful for me, is editing, writing as I go. It makes the end product a lot smoother and more finished.
Actually, Sam, I did want to ask you, because you've worked in edit, you've been an editor for so many years, does that sometimes become a bit of an impediment, because you have this sort of little urge to keep on correcting things till they are just perfect, and nothing is ever going to be absolutely perfect?
I think that's saying that perfectionism is the death of productivity or something around that. I think you really have to embrace that as a writer, don't you? You have to be really brave with your ideas and true to your characters, and you have a different hat that you put on. And when I say I'm editing things before I get into the writing of the next day, that's really a light touch. It's just feeling the emotion and the rhythm of the sentence. It's not. I write really cleanly. I put the full stops and the commas in the right place anyway, and I put the quote marks in the right place anyway. But I know lots of authors who don't do any of that. Was it Maeve Binchy who said she doesn't bother about any of that? That's the editor's job. The writer's job is just putting down the ideas. And yeah, I don't need to do any of that. That's for someone else. I love that idea.
Oh God, I don't think I could ever write like that. But it's great. I think one of the things that has come through is in both of your answers is the fact that I often find that when people sort of sit down to write children's books, there's this sort of deliberateness to it. There's this sort of deep consciousness of we're writing for children, and somehow that sometimes tends to make the text a little affected. It doesn't feel that natural. Sometimes it does feel a bit labored. So I think just freeing yourself of that sort of prejudice maybe and just writing is very helpful, and so thank you for that. I also actually wanted to ask you about the titles very briefly. Were the titles of your book something you came up with, or something that your editors or your publishers sort of suggested? Some?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, I really like the idea of this sort of power running through the veins of the children quite literally. And so that's why I settled on the kind of Fireblood. And I really wanted it to feel quite big brandy as well. And as something short and succinct that could then spin off into a series. But I struggle with titles. I also struggle with character names. And my first book that I wrote, which was a sort of a rom-com for what I would say a clean teen, for that kind of Kathy Cassidy genre, Jacqueline Wilson genre of fiction. The original title I had for that was I Will Not Wear a Pointy Hat. And it was about a girl who people thought, she was jinxed. She had this witchy element in her family, etc. I thought it was such a fantastic title. And my publishers hated it. And they changed it to Kisses for Lula, which is lovely. And readers like it, but I still like my original title.
Ami?
That's so funny. It makes me want to read it with the original title. I love it. Yes, I actually struggled quite a bit with the title, and honestly, like that's one of the biggest struggles I think to bring it to the U.S. because the image of the torchbearer is so different in the Indian ethos versus that of America. And I was born and raised in America, so I mean, but I kind of grew up in that ethos and mythology in my mind. So that's been a big struggle. This title actually came up because my husband had a previous book that I don't think it's even published, but that was the title. And he's like, and I said it, and he's like, yeah, just take it. And it was like, it was one of those things. But for me, the image of the torch being passed along, and I think there's this, I want to say it's a scene in Lord of the Rings where those bonfires are lit along the bridge. And I got goosebumps, and every time, and I think fire it's very powerful. It's huge in Hindu thought and mythology and rituals. So the fire is supposed to be the witness, the first, so that, and it is the only thing that literally can be passed from one to another. And I love this image of when you share a thought, an idea, or love, you don't have to extinguish one for the other to be lit. It is a multiplying process. And I thought that was so powerful. So I love the title. I don't know what I'll do in the future, in terms of its import to the U.S., but we'll see. But yes, I really was keen on that image of something being lit and passed along.
That's wonderful, Ami. Are you intending to make yours a series as well? Is a sequel in the making or something, if I may ask?
No, you may ask, and it's good because it forces me to think about it. I am one of those people who I don't want to do a sequel unless it's really meant to be. I have what I believe is a fairly strong idea. I'll be honest, I was, Torchbearers came out in India when the pandemic, like the first day, everything locked down. So I feel like I don't want to say the gods were against it, but I'm like, yo, please, So that was unfortunate timing wise. And then so to bring it to the US has been kind of, and then I've had a few things kind of fall through, mainly because small publishing houses were struggling as well at the time. So that's that. So that's one of the things I'm kind of working on. But I do have a good idea, I think, for a sequel, but I'd love to have them kind of be grown up and kind of explore how they would be in the same home now. They're reunited. And what does this mean for them? The bickering was strong during the pandemic in my house with my 3. And so when I started, the little I've written involves a whole lot of bickering. And but that's fun too. And that's something that you miss eventually, I think, when you're up and, on your own again. So yes, I hope so. And I loved, Sam, when you were talking, I was taking notes. I love your process because I think one of the things I struggle with a lot, because there are just so many other things that call your attention, is to take the time and make the time for writing and how to do it so that time actually yields something, even if it's not maybe words on a page, but there's something. And I love this idea of kind of the 45 minutes and then reading and then flowing into your writing. I love that. Thank you.
So that brings me to the last question before I ask you to read your favorite bits from your writing. But, both of your novels have been obviously published in very different markets. As you said, yours was published in India, and Sam, of course, yours was first published in the UK. Could you sort of take us through how that experience was, how that publishing experience was? I'd begin with you, Ami, in terms of how easy or difficult was it to find a publisher for your manuscript? And, did you need an agent, for instance? And what was the sort of editorial and marketing process with your book? I understand that the timing was a bit unfortunate, but, still, if you could sort of give us a brief insight.
Yes, I was lucky in that, Penguin India had an open enough submissions policy for me to kind of get those first chapters and a synopsis to them, and they did like it, and that I was very, very fortunate that initial impression was strong enough, and I think they were very receptive, and I think they got what I was wanting to do with the book, which is a gift if you get a team like that. I cannot say enough about Sorini and Smeeth, who just were so instrumental in kind of encouraging, and Smeeth and I worked a lot together, and I think we both are really happy with the book and what it is. I think the challenge for me was not being in the Indian writer space. Like, I didn't know any of those people. This was new to me. They've been wonderfully welcoming, but it was definitely, and it continues to be, just a bit of a challenge to kind of be in that world when I live here, and that I can't go to a festival there necessarily. But we finally did make one trip to India this winter, like the first. So that was a big deal. But so that's part of it. And I think, so that challenge is definitely there. And then in the US, like I said, I've had some agents show interest, but, they have like kind of a list of things that they want me to work on. A lot of it is creating more agency for the characters, even more than I already have, which is an interesting challenge to take on. But yes, I think it is, the publishing world is tough. I think Hindu mythology unfortunately gets lumped with politics, even though they're completely unrelated. So I think that sometimes even, and I didn't even use the word in the book because the word doesn't even exist in ancient texts, it is very, very universal. So I stayed away from that because I believe what I'm trying to do is something universal and beyond. So anyway, fingers crossed that something will come of it in the future as well. And, it's a good process, though. I do love the writing process itself, trying to focus on that.
Definitely, and I think the whole kind of commercial side of being published can be really tough, and it can be quite a daunting prospect. And I would urge any writer just not to think about it until you get to that stage. But you're telling a story you want to tell for the kind of reader who you want to entertain, because ultimately that is what we're doing. We're entertaining or educating or allowing our readers to feel something. I'm really lucky because I knew which agents to approach. I knew from their work and their authors the kinds of people I would like to work with, and I got lucky with my agent, who is Lucy Irvine at Peters Fraser Dunlop. I wanted someone who was young and hungry and a little bit inexperienced in the industry, because I wanted a fresh face to look at my story and not feel at all intimidated by the fact that I'd been in the industry for a very long time and I had, certain expectations. And she was just completely brilliant. So I submitted to 5 different agents. A couple of them came back straight away and said they would not be interested because they were already representing books about dragons. And that made me go, oh my God, what's happening out there? Because where I work in publishing, I specialize in editorial management, and I specialize in the second phase of editorial. So line editing, copy editing, proofreading. I've never, well, I have in my deep and murky past been a commissioning editor, but that I don't really like that element of the business. I like working with authors, crafting books, and doing that side of the business. So I'd been shielded from what was being commissioned out there. So when I had 2 rejections from 2 agents, I kind of freaked out. But then Lucy came and said, I love your book. And she had a conversation with me, and I thought, oh my gosh, you're absolutely perfect. And we had a cup of coffee and talked about it. And she said, it's very long. And I said, yes, we need to lose about 40,000 words, and I don't know where to lose them. Yeah, I'd written an enormous text. I'd basically written the first Lord of the Rings. So she was really helpful, and in saying, well, why don't you lose this angle and just keep these other threads? You could use this angle in book 2, for instance, and that's quite exciting. And then she went out on submission, and we were talking, Amy, earlier about deadlines and how you have things to work towards. And for me, Bologna in March is such a big book fair where agents are taking story ideas and selling across the world. And so for me, I wanted her to be able to have the book ready to sell at Bologna. So I was working really quickly on drafts and redrafts in order to do that. And before I got an agent, I had a film option offered to me, and it's oh God, why has his name gone out of my head? Anyway, the guy who did not David Heyman, the other David, who did the Harry Potter films, he read Fireblood and absolutely loved it, and said he definitely wanted to have the film option. So I said, which agent would you go for? And he also said Peters Fraser Dunlop, because they're very big on film. Their film team are very good. So for those reasons, I said yes to Lucy pretty much straight away. And then Peters Fraser Dunlop, and here I would urge any writer to really go with your gut and go with people who you feel really comfortable with, because PFD turned down the film option offer because they said it wasn't enough money. And this has happened to me twice in my career now. And I will say to you, forget about the money, go with the people that you believe in. David Barron, that's his name. So I need to have the courage, and that's another thing I struggle with as a writer, is just this sense of confidence. I have no confidence whatsoever. I need to have the confidence to send my copy of Fireblood to David Barron and go, come on, let's forget the PFD film option. What would you be interested in? Anyway, and then there were about 6 months where Lucy sent my manuscript around to everybody and said, would you be interested in publishing Fireblood? And they all came back, and you can see from a rejection letter whether somebody actually doesn't like it and doesn't believe in it, or whether they genuinely don't have space on their list or whatever. And what was interesting is that people were coming back and they were all saying, we're publishing a Dragons book. We're publishing a Dragons book. And I thought to myself, oh, really? Are you just being kind? But actually, when I look at what's happening with Kevin and Katie Tsang and with Catherine Rundell's Impossible Creatures, and just everyone at the moment has a dragon book. Even my publishing director of the time, Nick Lake, has just published a bloody dragons book. So I spent 10 years writing the book, and I was about 8 years too late in finishing it. But so then we got an offer from Firefly Press, and when Lucy and I first met to discuss this book and which kind of publishers we wanted to approach, I said, because I have all this experience working with the big five, I want to go for someone a bit smaller and more boutique who can really invest emotionally in the book. So she mentioned good connections with Firefly Press, who are a small independent publisher in Wales. And I was like, oh my God, there's Welsh in my book. They're perfect. But they took a long time to get back to us. And when they did, the offer was minuscule. It was absolutely tiny. And I said, don't care. I think these are the right publishers. And then Megha, you had another part to your question, which is, what is what has been the great bits about being published and what's been the challenging bits? And I mean, it sounds like you were really brilliantly supported at Penguin in India in terms of editorially. I feel I was really brilliantly supported editorially by my agent. And then Penny Thomas at Firefly is another brilliant editor. But when we got to the second part of the phase, which is line editing, copy editing, and proofreading, this is my area of expertise. And so I had certain ideas around, well, it's fine as it is. You don't even need to have a copy editor. How arrogant am I? And then the copy editor came in and made all sorts of changes. And I just thought, oh my God, no, stop it. So that was quite hard. And I'm, yeah, that was I found that very difficult. And then the cover process, I found that very difficult because I'm used to working with a certain style and a certain idea of what your cover is going to look like. And then they came up with some cover concepts and ideas, and the roughs and the illustration were great, but the actual design around the cover elements was not great. So I had to pull a prima donna moment and go, yeah, this book will not be published unless we can fix this, please, kindly. It was so harrowing and horrible. But Penny was brilliant, really supportive and wonderful. And yeah, so we got to a place. I like it. Hey, foil. And the marketing side of things, when you go with a smaller publisher, that's always going to be more challenging. You've got to assume responsibility. And I think the big difference between a big publisher and a smaller publisher, and I don't know what your experience is like around this, Ami, is that with big publishers, they'll have a budget and they'll tell you how they're spending it, and they go ahead and they spend it very expertly and skillfully. With a much smaller publisher, you are faced with certain kinds of options, like, are you going to spend money on the launch, or is there going to be a book proof, or will there be bookmarks and buttons for kids? So we had a few conversations around that, and working with a smaller publisher in that way was really fulfilling and brilliant, because you could have conversations and be aligned in your thinking as to how you wanted to get the book to market. That was great.
Yeah. Ami, do you have something to add to that?
No, I think for me, the absolutely, I agree that the process of writing is something I want to focus on. The stuff that comes afterwards is it has its own challenge. I was going to say that the role of social media was something I struggled with a little bit. I love telling stories, and that part was very natural to me, to share just ancient stories. And I got into that during the pandemic, actually, and that was super fun, and I loved it. And I still meet random kids who are like, I saw your stories. I'm like, oh, that makes me want to do more. But I will say that the part of social media that was the promoting or putting my own stuff out there, I still struggle with that. I just think, I don't know if it's an author thing. Like if I'm on stage dancing, I'm like, I own it. And then I have to like share something about my own. And I'm like, oh, I don't know, and so that imposter syndrome is real. And I think I really, really have to work on because, and I realize that when another author does it, I'm happy. And I'm like, yes, hey, I'm going to share this. And I don't think that about them. Why would I, why do I think that about myself? But aren't we always just the worst for ourselves? So, but yes, definitely learning how to navigate that.
No, I think it's also children's publishing in India is fairly new compared to in the UK. So a lot of the processes that you mentioned, Sam, and thank you for being so candid and taking us through all of these details of the process, because it's really important when one doesn't quite, have these discussions. A lot of these things don't really happen here. I mean, I don't think the whole Bologna thing happens really. I mean, but what you say about the small publishers and the big publishers is true to the extent that I think big publishers do have deeper pockets and can probably invest more into marketing the books compared to the smaller publishers who are, having to sort of look at their budget more sort of carefully and plan their expenses. And I also have author friends who say no matter which publisher they opt for, the big one or the small one, publishing is just such a sort of fate-driven venture, I suppose. Once your book is out in the world, it just acquires a life of its own. I mean, a lot of the authors do agree that they have to do a fair bit of heavy lifting in terms of promoting their book. But I do think that some of the bestsellers are bestsellers because they've just really lucked out big time. I I mean, yeah, I think that's one of the things which I love about publishing, because you never know which book that you're working on or whatever will suddenly be this thing that you never imagined it to be. But it's also the heartbreaking bit, because when I was working in publishing houses, some of the books that were really close to my heart just completely sank when they went out in the world. And I was like, oh God, why do you have to be so cruel? And why can't people like the book the same way I liked it? There's so much of personal investment. But Sam, I think there's something else I wanted to ask you. Sorry if I'm holding this up, but Ami said something very interesting about her being based in the US, but having a book out in India. It's something very interesting that we live in a very globalized world, but as somebody who's worked in publishing, do you think that it definitely helps if the author is based in the geography, if there's in which their book is published? For instance, if somebody is a foreign student and they've come to the UK and eventually their book gets published here, is it a challenge then? I mean, I can understand some of the physical challenges involved in that, in terms of not being.
Yes, definitely. I feel for you, Ami, because there are two things that are wonderful about being in the geography of your place of publication. The first is, as a writer for young people, your audience is school-based, and schools love to have visiting authors. So you as an author have agency in creating a space for your book within readers, because you can approach schools and say, I can come and speak to you and it will cost this much, and I will spend a day with you and I will inspire your students, and this is what I will do for you. So you are in one way promoting your book through schools networks, and children speak to each other, parents speak to each other, teachers speak to each other. So it's a wonderful way to do it, and I haven't mastered that, so I'm very much at the beginning stage of that, and I'm determined to do better. But the second thing that happens from those school events is just the most magical, glorious thing, and you'll know this as a teacher, Ami, is you are inspiring children, and you are seeing your story through their eyes, and you are seeing it come to life. I did a thing for World Book Day last month where I literally did events for the entire school from reception up to year 6, and the different kinds of things we did with Fireblood. For the reception children who are too young to read about the blood and the gore, I had a picture book around monsters and aliens, and I said, if you could draw an enemy of a dragon, what would it look like? And so we just went very visual. So that's the thing I would say, is if you are not in the geography of your place of publication, that can be really challenging, but it's not impossible because of online stuff. And I mean, I absolutely love your YouTube videos. I think they're absolutely fantastic. And it's so great. And you do it in such a short amount of time as well. You're just a natural performer. So a natural storyteller and performer. So yeah, it's not impossible. I think, do what you can with it. And I agree with you on social media. It's incredibly challenging. But if you do the thing that makes you feel happy, and this is something I also intend to do more of, is just be myself. I have this, for instance, a really a plate that is cracked halfway, and my highest level of engagement from my pitifully tiny Instagram account was I put a picture of the plate and I said, how much longer is this going to last? It's about to have some spaghetti bolognese. You know, it's that really. You've just got to do more of what means things to you and less of what you think you should be doing in terms of promoting books.
Yes, I think that's a lovely way of looking at it, because I do see that sometimes we get very caught up in I don't know how, engineering a bestseller, which is just, I think it's God's game. I really think, and since this is a pairing of books on mythology and fantasy, I think that's just a really good way of ending on that. I'm now going to ask both of you to do short readings of your favorite bits from your books, and then we're going to hand over to the lovely Lexi to take questions from the students. So Sam, Ami, you want to go first with Torchbearers? Please do read a little bit of the verse, if I may, just no pressure. But
oh yeah, oh gosh, I didn't even think about that. I found a passage that has stuff about the earth actually, but okay, I'll see what I can do. So because it's so like it's plotted so well that it's hard to find a little spot. But anyway, this is a scene where the torchbearers have decided to attack this oil rig, in which the demons have taken it over and they're using it to drill, and the various wind, fire, Varuna and the goddess Earth, all of them are kind of in the picture, and they've made this attack without very much of a plan. So a little bit of a fly-by-night. Bhumi, so Earth, Bhumi opened her joined hands. Ferns unfurled, spores flying into the demons' noses, making them sneeze. Climbing ivy rose up the sides of the rig. Flowering rose bushes grew, circling the demons with fragrance and thorns. A massive banyan tree dug its roots into the drilling platform, its branches shielding the children and their mother. Agni, fire, hauled himself onto the rig deck, still blazing, with dark smoke rising behind him. He threw sparks at the demons. The sparks grew wings and turned into fireflies that flew for the demons' eyes. The demons ran blindly away from them. Agni opened his mouth, crouching low to the deck. He stuck out a tongue of flame and exhaled a cloud of smoke. The demons aimed a fire hose at him. Agni wrapped his mouth around its end and swallowed it like a long noodle with a hiss of steam. The demons scattered as Agni swelled and looked around with unabated hunger. A helicopter beat the air over their heads, circling lower, closer and closer to Agni. It let out a cloud of pink, which turned into foam when it landed, flame retardant. The foam covered Agni's torso. He grabbed handfuls of it as if it were snow and threw it into the ocean, but he was noticeably smaller when the helicopter came around the second time. The foam landed again, this time covering Agni completely. He rolled on the deck, dimming, foaming at the mouth. Agni was dark now, mere embers, but he still let out thick smoke. None of the demons dared approach him. And I'm going to just kind of go forward. Agni is now dark. The deck was covered in pink foam, with froth blowing into the ocean, and Agni is out completely. Bhumi was livid as she attacked again. Sweeping her arms in front of her, she covered the deck with soil. With a jab of her finger, she grew a mushroom that mushroomed into more fungi. With her blue-green sari swirling around her, she looked like a spinning globe. On her third spin, Bhumi spread her arms, fanning open a forest, filling with animals and birds, all of which began attacking the demons. She flicked her red-tipped fingers, and scarlet macaws flew from them, swooping and clawing at the demons. Bhumi growled, and a jaguar leaped from the tree and grabbed the demon by the throat. Bhumi rubbed her hands together and hummed, keeping her eyes on the flower garden at her feet. Thousands of bees flew out of the flowers, their droning buzz and angry stingers chasing the demons. Bhumi smiled triumphantly at the torchbearers behind her. Not bad for a 5 billion-year-old planet, she said. And I'll just finish with a part that's not entirely that hopeful. The buzzing of bees was louder now, except it wasn't just the bees buzzing. The buzzing grew louder, joined by hundreds of identical buzzing sounds. The demons climbed towards Pumi holding chainsaws. They hacked away at the branches, trunks, and roots, withering the leaves and flowers. As the tree cover retreated, the animals were exposed. There was a putter of rifles. The demons were hunting. They shot macaws out of the sky, covering the deck with scarlet. The jaguar looked at the rifles, aimed at it, and growled. It jumped onto the railing of the deck and into the sea below. The demons destroyed Pumi's flora and fauna faster than she could grow them. Soon the forest was cleared out, the animals extinct. And then goes from there. This is the not so hopeful part of the book. And I didn't have a verse in there, I realized, but maybe next time.
All right.
That was lovely. I love the bees coming out of the flowers, Army. Well, I said before I love action stuff, so I've got an action scene. And what's happened here is that Finn and Tula, who are brother and sister, have gone home. They want to run back home and hide, and they can hear St. Patrick. They've come into an underground tunnel under their house, and they're about to go up through a trapdoor. Oh, no, they are in fact through the trapdoor, and this is what they see when they come into their house, which is St. Patrick and a bunch of monsters who are called the Venomous. Venomous was a good word to describe these monsters. Evil rolled from them in such strong waves that Finn and Tula could almost feel it poisoning the air, slithering over their skin. Their mouths, wide and lipless, resembled those of a cobra, with tongue and fangs to match. Their goat-like eyes bulged either side of nostril slits. The irises were blood red and seemed to move and flicker like flames. "Behind you!" yelled Patrick, whirling to face the monsters. He was now wearing what looked like enormous gloves with claws, the kind you'd buy in a dress-up shop for Halloween. Finn and Tula spun to find themselves face to face with an 8-foot venom. Finn was only dimly aware of Tula's lightning-fast signing. "Finn, use that light from before!" He was already dropping into a crouch, his fingers angled upwards, and in an instant white-hot beams shot in a torrent from his hands. But the creature, coming straight for him, merely raised his forearm in a cry of rage as the light licked his eyeballs. "Tula!" yelled Finn as the venom roared again, thudding another step closer. Patrick was a blur of movement, holding off the monsters, whirling, weaving, whirling again, and Finn's body shook with the effort of blasting the strange light from his hands. He felt fear pull his heart into a tight knot. He had nothing left. "Your turn," he signed to his sister in desperation. Tula was already drawing a painful, ragged breath. With her eyes narrowed, she exhaled out into the room, crackling the air with a freezing cold. Instantly, every creature around them was frozen in place, unable to move. Finn fell to his knees, sagging with a relief so intense it made him feel sick. "Whoa," he moaned. "That was close." "Close? Close?" Tula whirled on him. "We should never have come up here, Finn." "Patrick would have been a total goner if we hadn't helped," said Finn, outraged. "That bumbrain can look after himself," signed Tula. "I dunno," said Finn, slowly. He went over to where Patrick crouched, centimetres from the lethal blade of the biggest venom of them all. "You saved his life." He looked back at Tula. "This monster over here was about to lop off his head." Tula just stared, astonished, at Patrick. With his heart in his mouth, Finn turned back to look at the Irishman. "You have got to be kidding me," he breathed. Ice was prickling and cracking in tiny fragments that fell to the floor with a chiming sound as Patrick began to move. He eased his limbs slowly until he was standing. You broke Tula's ice," murmured Finn. His eyes skittered around the room, but all the Venomous were still frozen solid. "I always break the ice," said Patrick, with an ironic quirk of his eyebrow. "And actually," he added, "I was perfectly fine." So that's my action scene. And then we talked a little bit about disability and what that can mean, and when children feel vulnerable and different. This is a scene where, in order to save the world, the children need to find the special potion that their dad created called Hydrant. And the hydrant they want to use in a volcano to calm the whole volcano. So they are in this watchtower on an island called Portal Door, and Patrick and George, the two saints, are helping to look for this hydrant. It's a conversation. The hydrant must be here, George. And I wish I could do an Irish accent, but I can't. The hydrant must be here, George, said Patrick. Maybe he shielded it. He did that a lot when they all lived here, but I know all his hiding places. He whirled away and began searching, teasing away plants, pressing wooden panels, leaping from table to stairs to shelves and back to the table again, his movements quick and sure, but a little frantic. How will we come with you if we cannot fly? Signed Tula. What did she say? Asked Angelina. They can't fly, said Charlie. Patrick paused briefly in his search to note, so they cannot come on this quest. There was a stunned pause, and George was just about to say something when Angelina cried, They're Augustus's children, of course they can fly. He has no wings, interrupted Patrick, sweeping aside a jumble of scientific instruments from the table and pulling open the lid of a wooden box. They won't grow from... He gestured at Finn's hunched back and trailed off. There was silence in the room. Then Finn spoke, and his voice was bleak. It's true. I have no wings, and Tula wasn't born with any either. The adult stared back at him blankly. And stammered Finn, shifting uncomfortably. I was wondering if it's because I have this hump and if there's anything that can be done to fix it. There was another stunned silence, even Patrick halting his search to walk slowly back down the stairs, and for some reason Finn felt his throat close up with a hurt that smarted his eyes. You do not need fixing, Finn Flint, said George, his voice gravelly with the intensity of what he was saying. Like all of us, you just need to grow in a different way. Different people have different strengths, different powers. You are more powerful than you know. Tula's hand crept into Finn's, and he swallowed hard, unable to speak. And then I've got a little scene about the bad guys in the book. So children have these relationships with each other, don't they? And you have friends and you have arch enemies. And this is this girl and this boy. They're really unpleasant. And we've all experienced unpleasant bullying types in the playground. So here's a little scene from this. And what's happening here is that Finn and Tula and this boy called Charlie, who's slightly older than them, let's see who else is in the scene. They are talking about Finn and Tula's dad, who's called Augustus, who's the guy who created the hydrant, but he's been ostracized and he's gone missing. So here they are, they're meeting for the first time. Our father is Simon Veritas, said the girl, and he has connections to all military and political intelligence the world over. Well, drawled Charlie, collecting up all the plates on the table. Not sure about how intelligent his intelligence is, if it's suggesting there's no hope for Augustus. Oh, please, said the boy. Everyone on the island already knows Augustus is a lost cause. Don't listen to Bestivo, said Charlie to Finn and Tula, his jaw clenched, or his silver-tongued twin. They know nothing. We know how to get into the labyrinth, said Bestivo, his smirk widening, and we know the griffin is in there. That's the grumpy grey griffin. The griffin is in there still, and me and Meritas, he nodded to his sister, we know that's because Patrick has failed to persuade him to rescue the mighty Augustus. Yes, said Meritas with a triumphant smile. Oh, shut up, snapped Charlie, flushed with anger. Make me, taunted Bestivo, and he laughed as he dodged the huge messy ball of blue flame that Charlie hurled at him. Charlie's fire roared again, but Meritas and Bestivo flung their arms up in defence, and the next ball of flame shattered into dancing stars that spun in the air, making squealing noises before bursting into showers of sparks with a rude raspberry sound. The twins leaped into the air with a showy explosion of colourful wings. Forget about Augustus, yelled Meritas. Forget about the griffin, called Bestivo, laughing openly now. Instead, we go to war, they both shouted as they zoomed straight up out of the courtyard, disappearing into the shifting clouds above. War! Their voices echoed in the sudden silence of the courtyard. War! 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 And Finn, though he'd not stopped to think about feelings since their father had disappeared, felt suddenly emptied by a wave of grief so immense that it was strangely hard to breathe. I should have ended on a funny one, not a sad thing.
I did the same thing. It was like, that's the least hopeful you can do. All right, kids, you got to take over and save the planet now.
Megha, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm just really scared of the cuckoo clock on my wall. It decides to show up at the oddest timings. I just peep out. And yes, anyway, but such lovely bits of reading. And, you know, Sam, I loved the voices that you did. I am so conscious of making these voices when I'm reading to children, because I absolutely failed at the drama class. So what I tend to do if I'm forced to sort of have this sort of reading, which I think really dim-witted people would invite me to do a reading like that, I think. But, you know, I get the children to start reading it in different voices. But I see that we don't have too much of time. Lexi, how are we on time? I think we can take some questions from the students for sure.
Yes, we have a couple of minutes. If anyone has a question, pop it in the chat or do raise your hand now. That would be absolutely lovely. I'll just give you a second. Yes, there's a question from Caitlin. Caitlin, are you happy to unmute? That would be wonderful.
Sure, yeah. I was curious, you touched briefly, sort of lumped together, talking about the difficulty of titles and character names. And I agree, having struggled with both. And we got to hear a little bit more about the title, but do either of you have sort of further tips or insights about where you pull those character names from?
I have to confess something, and you're going to think less of me. I have a baby names book. And I also, for me, character names, the meanings of the names are really important. So I look for a meaning, and I'll really hunt for a character name, and it's got to feel right. And I'm still not sure about the name Finn. I probably shouldn't share that, but I'm still not sure about the name Finn. But I love the name Tula. Tula is a Xhosa word which means silence, and it just felt completely right for her.
I love that. Yeah, I'll in brief tell you that Samhita is what you call the end part of a Veda, like of a hymn. And so it just made sense. And then she could be shortened to Sam, in fact. So that's kind of nice. But Brahm was very important to me to have, meaning love. And I felt like he was the one who was, I think, most starved of love, most struggling with expressing his love and expressing himself. And I thought it was a nice kind of double-edged name for him. So
you can go online and get some. You can get some. There are some sort of AI, artificial intelligence name generators, and I've never had any success with those. But other people might do. But sometimes they can kind of spark an idea. I always think our own human imaginations are far more vital than something that's automatically generated. But sometimes it can, get an idea going.
Thank you so much.
I think we've got a question from John. Thank you very much joining us from Ashoka. So John says, I hope it's okay to read this out, but do unmute if you prefer, John. That's wonderful. Absolutely up to you. I wish to ask Sam about her thought process, though we'll open this as a general thing, behind deciding to have an origin story for the Fireblood world running at the bottom of the pages. How did you come to be interested in that format of a story within a story? Yes, I did decode the story and write it down to piece it together. I think my inner child healed from that. So thank you, really. Oh, that's beautiful.
John, that's got to be one of the best messages I've ever had from a reader. So thank you. That is your gift to me, completely and utterly. That origin story is, we talked before about how you write around a novel and a story, and how you have to cut words a lot. That origin story were the first two chapters of my book for 10 years. And in the end, they had to go. And it was interesting that all the agents and the publishers who did take a look at the book, they all said the first two chapters where we have St. George in the cave with the last dragon, it felt like it was setting a tone that wasn't true to the rest of the novel, because the rest of the novel is very much situated on this magical island of Portaldor in present day. It's sort of like a present day world removed from electricity and abundant with green in the end, and all that sort of thing. But that origin story was really important to me, because that's for me where the relationship between George and the dragon dragon comes into it, and it's the start of the Fireblood mythology, essentially. So I loved having the opportunity of putting it in a code at the bottom. And I created my own typeface, is the way I did the code, is I created my own typeface. That was really fun to do. And children love coding and decoding. So that's why I wanted to do it that way. And I'm really pleased it worked for you, John. Thank you.
That's such a lovely question. And Ami, can I pass that to you as well? And sort of say, you talked about how you had a huge amount of stuff that you wrote, and then you had this new idea for where to open, but you still brought some of the back stuff back in. Did you have a rule of thumb for yourself about what you did take from all of that previous work? Because that sort of craft stuff around, how do you pick when you have this massive other stuff? What do you leave out? What do you put in? So if we can open that to you as well.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest central stories was this churning of the ocean, this idea that two really opposing elements have to come together, put aside their differences, even if briefly, and tackle this bigger problem, even bigger than all the gods' powers and all the demons' powers. So to me, it was important to get that part of the story in there. And then how that happened was something I was working with. And then how to translate this very old idea, like with the mountain and this and that, into like a modern day, what would modern day poison look like? What would, what were they aiming for? All those things. So I think then the drilling of the ocean, the rig, all that kind of came together. So yes, I think that was the decision I had to make, was, do I want that story? And then how close do I want to hew to the original myth? And then where do I diverge? And I think that was a big part of the new writing process that I did.
Thank you both so much. If anyone has a last quick question, do raise your hand or pop it in the chat now. I just wonder if we circle around in our last couple of minutes before we close. It's so lovely to get an international perspective, because it's so rare to do that. So thank you both so much for your time. Is there anything that sort of came out of the conversation today, or from your thoughts in general about that you'd like to add about how much you do hear from readers in other countries, whether you hear anything at all, what you wish you would hear if you didn't hear enough about it? Because that's a theme that's come out of a lot of our stuff so far, how little books travel and how little conversations travel. So just to throw that out as a sort of prompt for any thoughts on that topic. Shall I come to you, Sam, and then to you, Ami, and then we'll go back to Meghaa to close. And thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Lexi. That's really kind of you to say. Because of my South African, because I grew up in South Africa, I have people in South Africa who've read the book, which is amazing. I have family in Australia. And this morning I had an email from someone saying they're reading it to their son, Ben, in bed, who's 10 years old. And it means so much. It means more than anything. And what people say about this particular book over and over is they like the pace and they like the humor. And I think that if we are being mindful of our readers, what we do need to recognize is that the way they are culturally sensitized really is by lots of action and quick screen things, and so that has informed my writing and has inspired me to think about that work on the page and making it quick for readers who might not be avid literary readers, essentially. Does that answer the question? Not really.
Yes, I'm so grateful to you for bringing people from all over the world to this conversation. And the more I read and more I explore, as I had started with in the beginning, I just feel like everyone at some level has this kind of connection to the natural world, and we do it through stories. And it's fascinating to me to see how that kind of comes through all over the globe. I think, for example, goddess worship for me is kind of huge. And I think this idea of the divine feminine and all that, you just see it popping up in all these different ways. And I find it, every time I get chills, because it's like, there it is again. There is the mother kind of showing herself through this power. And I just find that fascinating that readers all over the world can dig that in their own way. And to see the way that different mythologies and stories do it is fascinating. And I love hearing from readers who are like, oh, your book is all trashed and messed up because I read it. So I'm like, yes, that's the best thing ever. So and Sam, this has been so inspiring. And Meghaa, Lexi, this is just a great conversation. I've grown so much just in the last hour and a half from talking to you all. So I'm just very grateful.
Absolutely want to reiterate that it's such a magical experience to be interacting with creators and fellow creatives in this way. It's really uplifting and rewarding. Thank you so much for hosting this and making this a thing. It's wonderful.
I think there's something else that John wants to say. He says, I don't mean to take too much time, but I did share Sam, your book, with a child of deaf adults. And she said she was so touched by Tula's character and will share it with her little brother next. She mentioned that if they grew up reading books like this, it would have made navigating a hearing/non-hearing world so much more gentler on their senses. So that's yeah, I mean, it's lovely, isn't it?
Oh, that absolutely brings me to tears. That's such a wonderful thing to hear. And yeah, there are no words in the moment for that. That's just amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, John.
Well, I think the wonderful thing about this entire initiative, and I'm so glad to have, a co-founder like Lexi, who shares the vision and who shares, I think she is probably even more enthusiastic about it sometimes than I am about some things. But, one of the things that we really are attempting to do with this is to have these sort of conversations that don't really happen in the world of publishing, where we sit down and really talk about books across cultures and how readers around the world are sort of navigating books and what they make of literature from other parts of the world, how that literature is created. So it's just been so wonderful to hear from both you, Ami, and from you, Sam, about your books, about how you wrote them, about the publishing process and all of its eccentricities and its wonders. Thank you so much. And it's been such a wonderful way to start off our season 2 of Literature Across Borders. I think Lexi would agree with that. But I'm not going to take any more time because we're awfully over time. But thank you so much for tuning in and spending this time. And yeah, we are very excited about releasing this to the public and for everyone to hear all of the wonderful conversation that happened here. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.